British television spent decades turning ordinary character actors into household names, faces the entire country recognized instantly from a single line of dialogue or one memorable catchphrase delivered week after week in front of millions of viewers. Fame on that scale rarely translated into lasting financial security, though, especially for performers working before the era of streaming residuals and modern repeat fees, and a striking number of Britain's most familiar faces ended up genuinely forgotten, broke, or both, long before their actual deaths. It's a pattern the industry itself has rarely acknowledged publicly, even as it kept repeating generation after generation. Before we get into it, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because this channel tells the real, documented stories behind classic entertainment that most retrospectives leave out. Number 1. Charles Hawtrey. Charles Hawtrey appeared in 23 Carry-On films, becoming one of the series' most instantly recognizable faces through his prissy, high-pitched comic delivery across nearly 2 decades of British cinema. His drinking grew progressively worse throughout the 1960s, and after Carry On Abroad in 1972, producer Peter Rogers dropped him from the franchise entirely, later explaining that Hawtrey had become impossible to work with once alcohol took hold of his behavior on set, ending a nearly 2-decade run as one of the series' most consistently used performers almost overnight. A sudden professional cutoff that left him with far fewer working years and far less income than his earlier fame might have suggested. A stark reminder of just how quickly a single decision from a producer could reshape an actor's entire remaining career, with no real recourse or appeal available once that decision had actually been made. He retired to the seaside town of Deal in Kent, where his relative poverty and increasingly erratic, reclusive behavior alienated locals who had initially welcomed a genuine film star into their community, a warm reception that gradually curdled into quiet resentment as his drinking and difficult moods became a regular feature of local life. Hawtrey died alone on October 27, 1988, at age 73, and by that point he had become such a recluse that many of his former Carry On co-stars didn't even learn of his death until well after the fact. A quiet, delayed reckoning for a man who had once been one of the most instantly recognizable faces in British comedy. Number 2. Joan Sims. Joan Sims appeared in 24 Carry On films, more than almost any other actor in the franchise's history, becoming one of British comedy's most beloved and reliably funny character performers throughout the 1960s and 1970s. In her final years, as her health deteriorated and depression closed in following the deaths of her agent, her closest friend Hattie Jacques, and her own mother within a 2-year span, Sims found herself in genuine financial difficulty, 3 devastating losses arriving in such close succession that friends said she never really had the chance to properly grieve any one of them before the next hit. A compounding grief that colleagues believe played a direct role in her subsequent decline, leaving her increasingly isolated at precisely the moment she most needed the kind of support a lifetime in the public eye should have made easier to find, rather than harder, as it apparently turned out to be. Her friend, actress Liz Fraser, personally approached Carry On producer Peter Rogers, by then a millionaire many times over, asking him to help cover Joan's medical and living costs, only to be flatly refused. She spent her remaining years largely isolated in her Kensington flat, battling alcoholism, and died on June 27, 2001, from liver failure, a quiet, difficult end for a woman who had made an entire nation laugh for decades. Friends who visited her during those final years described a woman who still lit up with flashes of the old comic timing, even as her physical health continued declining around her. Number 3. Arthur Lucan. Arthur Lucan spent over 3 decades performing as the cross-dressing comic character Old Mother Riley, first on stage and later in a hugely popular series of films that made him one of the highest-paid entertainers in Britain during the 1930s and 1940s. His wife and stage partner, Kitty McShane, was notoriously unfaithful and reckless with money, and her spending habits gradually drained Lucan's considerable fortune over the course of their turbulent decades-long partnership, a private dynamic that stood in sharp contrast to the beloved, wholesome comic image the two of them projected together on stage and screen. a gap between public persona and private reality that audiences at the time had absolutely no way of knowing about, watching the two of them trade affectionate insults on stage, with no idea what was actually happening once the curtain came down, laughing along with an act built entirely on a chemistry that offstage was under constant, quiet strain. By 1954, Lucan was facing formal bankruptcy proceedings, and on May 17th of that year, while waiting in costume to go on stage at the Tivoli Theatre in Hull, he collapsed and died, just 1 week before he was scheduled to appear in bankruptcy court. The man who had once commanded some of the biggest box office numbers in British cinema died with almost nothing left to his name, undone entirely by the same partnership that had once made him famous. Colleagues who worked with him in his final years described a performer still fully committed to the character even as his personal finances collapsed around him, determined to keep working right up until the very end. That same dedication was on full display the night he died, still in full costume and makeup, waiting for a curtain call that would never actually come, a final performance the audience that evening never actually got to see. Number 4. Kitty McShane. Kitty McShane spent decades as Arthur Lucan's real-life wife and on-stage comic partner, playing opposite him in the old Mother Riley films and stage shows that made the both of them household names across Britain for a generation. After a beauty salon venture she'd invested in collapsed, she continued relying on Lucan's earnings to fund her lifestyle, and following his death in 1954, she attempted to continue the old Mother Riley act with a new performer, a venture that failed to recapture any of the original act's popularity or income, proving just how much of the act's original success had depended specifically on the chemistry between her and Lucan himself, a partnership that, for all its private turmoil, had produced something genuinely irreplaceable on stage, a chemistry built over decades of performing together that simply couldn't be manufactured or replaced with someone new, no matter how hard anyone involved in the later attempts tried to recreate it. Whether the reckless spending that historians say helped bankrupt her husband was driven by genuine financial mismanagement or something else entirely that neither of them ever spoke about publicly remains a question biographers still debate without any clear resolution, so let us know what you think really happened between the two of them in the comments below. McShane spiraled into serious alcoholism after the death of a close friend in 1963, and when she died at her London home in March 1964, there was so little record kept of her final arrangements that, unlike her husband's still maintained grave, no one today knows exactly where she was buried. It's an oddly fitting, unresolved footnote to a partnership that had once been one of the most successful acts in British entertainment, reduced by the end to a single, unmarked, forgotten resting place. Researchers and fans who've tried tracking down burial records over the years have come away empty-handed every time, leaving the question genuinely, permanently unanswered, a small but persistent mystery that continues to surface whenever her story comes up in books and documentaries about the era. Number 5. Wilfrid Brambell. Wilfrid Brambell became a household name playing the grasping, manipulative rag-and-bone man Albert Steptoe opposite Harry H. Corbett in Steptoe and Son, one of the most popular sitcoms in British television history throughout the 1960s and 1970s. Despite that massive fame, biographers have described his personal life in later years as increasingly lonely and isolated, a private existence that stood in sharp contrast to the boisterous, larger-than-life character audiences knew him for every week, a gap between public persona and private reality that several other names on this list shared as well. A recurring theme that says as much about the demands of fame as it does about any single individual's own choices, suggesting the underlying pressures were systemic rather than personal failings unique to any one performer, a pattern built into the structure of the industry itself, rather than a coincidence repeated by chance. He continued working steadily after Steptoe and Son ended, including a memorable turn as Paul McCartney's fictional grandfather in the Beatles' film A Hard Day's Night, but colleagues noted he never seemed to build the kind of close personal support network his level of fame might have suggested, remaining a somewhat guarded, private figure even at the height of his popularity. Brambell died of cancer at his home in Westminster on January 18, 1985, at age 72, and remarkably, his funeral was attended by only 6 people, a strikingly small gathering for a man whose face had once been recognized in nearly every household across the country. The contrast between his enormous public fame and the quiet, sparsely attended reality of his final send-off has since become one of the most frequently cited examples of just how quickly television celebrity can fade once the cameras stop rolling, a detail biographers still bring up whenever discussing the gap between public adoration and private isolation in British show business, a gap that seems to have widened rather than narrowed, as his own celebrity grew larger over the years. Number 6. Freddie Frinton. Freddie Frinton spent years touring British music halls before finally achieving mainstream television success at age 55, playing a bumbling plumber opposite Thora Hird in the sitcom Meet the Wife during the mid-1960s. His most enduring legacy actually came from a short comedy sketch called Dinner for One, which he first performed on stage in 1945 and later recorded for German television in 1963. A decision that turned him into a genuine annual New Year's Eve tradition across several Central European countries, an outcome nobody involved in that original modest recording session could possibly have predicted at the time. Least of all, Frinton himself, who reportedly viewed the whole sketch as a minor piece of work rather than anything destined for lasting fame, a modest assessment that turned out to badly undersell just how far the routine would eventually travel, reaching audiences across an entire continent he likely never even considered while first performing it on a modest British stage. Astonishingly, despite becoming one of the most watched performers in continental European television history, with his sketch airing every single New Year's Eve for decades, Frinton remained almost entirely unknown and forgotten in his own home country of Britain. He died suddenly of a heart attack in October 1968 at age 59, never fully realizing just how enormous and enduring his accidental international fame would eventually become, a fame his own countrymen barely knew existed at all. Decades after his death, the same 4-minute sketch still draws tens of millions of viewers across Germany, Austria, and Scandinavia every single New Year's Eve, making him one of the most watched British performers in history, without most of Britain ever realizing it, a strange, almost accidental form of global stardom that his own country has barely ever acknowledged, with most British broadcasters never bothering to rerun the sketch that made him a household name literally everywhere else. Number 7. Richard O'Sullivan. Richard O'Sullivan starred as the charming, perpetually broke chef Robin Tripp in the massively popular sitcom Man About the House during the mid-1970s, a role that made him one of British television's biggest young stars at the height of his career. He continued that same character into the spin-off Robin's Nest, maintaining his position as a genuine household name throughout the remainder of the decade before gradually stepping back from major roles during the 1980s and 1990s, a slower, quieter fade from prominence than the abrupt endings several other performers on this list experienced. Though the eventual outcome, a long stretch of relative anonymity, ended up looking remarkably similar in the end, regardless of how gradually or abruptly each individual career actually wound down, a slow fade or a sudden ending, eventually arriving at the very same quiet, forgotten destination. In 2003, O'Sullivan suffered a severe stroke from which he never fully recovered, leaving him unable to continue working or living independently for the remainder of his life. He has lived ever since at Brinsworth House, a retirement home in Twickenham run by a charity specifically established to support entertainment industry workers who have nowhere else to turn, a quiet, largely forgotten final chapter for an actor who was once one of the most recognizable faces on British television. Former co-stars and fans have occasionally visited over the years, but for the most part, the transition from prime-time leading man to long-term care resident happened almost entirely out of public view, unfolding gradually enough that many former viewers still assume he simply retired comfortably decades ago, an assumption that reflects less about the facts of his actual situation and more about how easy it is to lose track of a performer once they stop appearing regularly on screen. Number 8. Rodney Bewes. Rodney Bewes became a household name playing Bob Ferris opposite James Bolam's Terry Collier in The Likely Lads and its sequel series, two of the most beloved and critically respected sitcoms in the entire history of British television. Following a bitter falling out with his co-star, Bolam refused to allow the original series to be shown in reruns on terrestrial television, a decision that effectively cut off Bewes from years of repeat fees that might otherwise have provided him with financial stability later in life, a single personal disagreement with lasting financial consequences that followed him for the rest of his career. A reminder of just how much of an actor's long-term livelihood can hinge on decisions made by other people entirely. Decisions an actor themselves often has no real power to influence or reverse once they've been made, leaving even the most talented performers dependent on the goodwill of people whose priorities rarely match their own. Bewes spoke candidly and without much bitterness about the resulting gap between his own modest finances and what he assumed was his former co-star's far greater wealth, joking in interviews that he'd ended up with little more than an overdraft and a mortgage to show for his career, a self-deprecating honesty that made him a genuinely sympathetic figure to journalists covering the story over the years, several of whom noted that he seemed genuinely more interested in talking about the work itself than in dwelling on the money he'd missed out on, a perspective that seemed to bring him more peace than bitterness ever could have, a hard-won outlook that took him years of reflection to fully arrive at. He continued working steadily in smaller roles until his death in November 2017 at age 79, largely remembered, by his own account, for just the one show, but grateful, he said, to be remembered for something at all. He gave interviews right up until his final years, always speaking about the show and his old co-star with more warmth than bitterness, despite the financial gap that had opened up between them, a graciousness that journalists covering the story consistently remarked on with genuine admiration. Number 9. Arnold Ridley. Arnold Ridley wrote the massively successful stage thriller The Ghost Train as a young man in the 1920s, only to sell the amateur performance rights for just £200 during a period of financial hardship, a decision he spent the rest of his life regretting as the play went on to earn its eventual owners a genuine fortune. Decades later, in his 80s, Ridley found lasting fame all over again, playing the elderly, frequently incontinent Private Godfrey in Dad's Army, a role that made him newly famous to an entire generation who had no idea he'd once been a celebrated playwright in his own right. A genuine second act few actors of any era ever managed to pull off so late in life. Arriving at an age when most performers have long since accepted that their biggest opportunities are firmly behind them, making his late career reinvention all the more remarkable given how rarely it happens to anyone at all, let alone to someone already well into his 80s by the time it finally arrived. According to his own son, Ridley lived with near-constant financial anxiety throughout his later years, continuing to wait by the phone for audition calls well into his 80s, largely out of genuine economic necessity, rather than simple love of the craft, even as audiences watching him each week on Dad's Army had no idea just how much financial pressure sat behind that gentle, doddering on-screen persona, a performance so warm and reassuring that it gave no hint whatsoever of the real anxiety the actor himself was quietly carrying, a gap between character and performer that only makes the story that much more affecting in hindsight, especially for viewers revisiting the show today with the fuller picture in mind. He continued working on Dad's Army until the series ended in 1977, when he was 81 years old, and died in 1984 at Denville Hall, a retirement home for actors, having spent much of his final decade managing money worries that his beloved late career fame never fully resolved. His son later wrote candidly about watching his father manage that anxiety for decades, describing a man who never lost his dedication to the craft, even as the financial rewards remained frustratingly modest, a portrait of quiet perseverance that only became public knowledge years after Ridley's own death, when his son finally felt ready to share the fuller, more complicated story behind the beloved on-screen character audiences thought they knew. Number 10. Stuart Sherwin. Stuart Sherwin spent decades as one of British television's most reliable jobbing character actors, appearing in small guest roles across an astonishing run of beloved classic sitcoms, including Dad's Army, Are You Being Served?, Fawlty Towers, Terry and June, and Yes, Minister. Despite that remarkable body of work spanning some of the most iconic and frequently rewatched comedies in British broadcasting history, Sherwin himself never became a recognizable name to the audiences who watched those very shows, always appearing as a background face rather than a headline performer. He continued working steadily in theater and pantomime well into the early 2000s, treating the stage as his real professional home, even as his television guest spots quietly built up an impressive, but largely uncredited legacy, a decades-long career built almost entirely on small, easily overlooked contributions to shows other people became famous for, the kind of steady, dependable work that keeps an entire industry running without ever earning its own spotlight. Sherwin died on April 23, 2015, at age 87, at Denville Hall, the same retirement home for entertainment industry workers that had already cared for several other names on this list. A final chapter almost nobody outside the industry ever noticed. Number 11. Edgar Refford. Edgar Refford trained at the prestigious Old Vic School before building a long, distinguished career as a supporting actor across British television, taking on guest roles in landmark series including The Avengers, Van der Valk, and Blake's 7 throughout the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. Despite appearing in some of the most fondly remembered cult television of the era, sharing scenes with major stars like Patrick Macnee, Refford himself never crossed over into anything resembling mainstream household recognition, remaining exactly the kind of dependable supporting player that keeps a production running smoothly without ever pulling focus from the leads. A genuinely valuable skill that the industry has rarely rewarded with anything close to lasting recognition, no matter how consistently that reliability actually contributed to a production's overall success, since audiences tend to remember the stars they were told to notice, rather than the people quietly making everything else work. He continued working steadily on stage and screen for decades, building the kind of dependable, respected character actor career that rarely earns lasting public memory, no matter how consistently the work itself holds up. Refford spent his final years battling Parkinson's disease at Denville Hall, where he died in 2006 at age 82, his once extensive body of guest appearances largely forgotten by the same audiences who'd unknowingly watched him for decades. Fellow residents of the retirement home reportedly enjoyed hearing his stories about working alongside major stars of the era, even as his own name remained unfamiliar to nearly everyone outside that small circle. A small, appreciative audience for a lifetime of stories most of the public would never get to hear. Tales of working alongside some of the biggest names in British television that might otherwise have simply disappeared along with him. Small pieces of entertainment history preserved only through casual conversation rather than any formal record. The kind of detail that vanishes almost entirely once the people who lived through it are gone. Number 12. Robin Wentworth. Robin Wentworth built a genuinely prolific television career spanning decades, appearing across an unusually wide range of landmark British series, including Dixon of Dock Green, Z-Cars, Crossroads, and 2 entirely separate roles on Coronation Street, nearly a decade apart from one another. His most substantial credit came playing Ted Dawson across 116 episodes of the early soap opera United, a role that made him a genuine regular presence in British living rooms for an extended period during the 1960s, a program largely forgotten today despite once being appointment viewing for a significant portion of the country, a reminder that even genuinely massive television popularity offers no real guarantee of lasting cultural memory. Despite that remarkable volume of work across so many different beloved shows, Wentworth's name never became attached to any single iconic role the way so many of his contemporaries did, leaving him something of an invisible fixture of the era rather than a genuine star. He died on August 16, 1997, at age 82, at Denville Hall, having spent a television career that most viewers experienced constantly without ever actually learning his name. His decades of steady, reliable supporting work across some of British television's most enduring early dramas remain almost entirely uncatalogued in popular memory today, despite the sheer volume of screen time he quietly accumulated, the kind of body of work that exists almost entirely in the background of shows other people are remembered for, a career's worth of contributions that helped hold together some of British television's most enduring productions without ever earning individual recognition, the connective tissue of an entire era of programming that rarely gets acknowledged on its own terms, work that made the more celebrated performances around it possible in the first place. Number 13. Alan Freeman. Alan Freeman became one of British broadcasting's most recognizable voices, presenting the chart show Pick of the Pops on radio for decades, while also becoming a familiar face on television, through his regular hosting duties on Top of the Pops throughout the 1960s and beyond. His catchphrase "Greetings, Pop Pickers" made him an instantly recognizable figure to multiple generations of British music fans who grew up watching him introduce their favorite songs and artists on national television. A warm, familiar voice that soundtracked Sunday afternoons for households across the entire country for decades running, the kind of ever-present broadcasting fixture that fades from memory only once it's actually gone. In his final years, worsening arthritis and asthma from decades of heavy smoking left him reliant on a walking frame, and from the year 2000 onward, he lived at Brinsworth House, the same entertainment industry retirement home that would later also care for Richard O'Sullivan. Freeman died there on November 27, 2006, at age 79. A broadcasting legend who spent his last years relying on the same charitable safety net built specifically for entertainers who found themselves with nowhere else to go. Fans who'd grown up listening to his broadcasts decades earlier were often genuinely surprised to learn just how modest his final living circumstances had actually become. A disconnect between his larger-than-life radio persona and the quieter reality of his final years that many found genuinely difficult to reconcile. The booming, larger-than-life voice on the airwaves giving no hint at all of the frailer man behind it, a version of himself that existed only in front of a microphone rather than in the quieter reality of daily life, a performance so consistent across decades that listeners could be forgiven for assuming it was simply who he always was. Number 14. Frederick Hall. Frederick Hall built one of British television's quietly most extensive supporting careers, racking up guest appearances across an enormous range of iconic shows, including Z-Cars, Doctor Who, Survivors, Bergerac, and Boone, along with an early recurring role on Emmerdale Farm. Despite appearing in so many genuinely beloved and frequently rewatched programs, spanning nearly 4 decades of British broadcasting, Hall himself never became a name audiences specifically tuned in to see. Always the reliable supporting presence rather than the reason people watched. His filmography reads almost like a history of British television itself, touching nearly every major genre from science fiction to crime drama to soap opera, yet his own name remains almost entirely unknown outside dedicated classic television circles today, the very definition of a face everyone has seen without anyone actually knowing who he was. A strange, specific kind of anonymity that comes only from decades spent working steadily just outside the spotlight. Hall died on November 28, 1995, at age 72, closing out a career defined by genuine, consistent craftsmanship that never once translated into the kind of lasting public recognition his enormous body of work might otherwise have suggested. Television historians cataloging British broadcasting's golden decades have occasionally singled him out as a kind of case study in quiet, reliable professionalism that the industry rarely rewards with anything beyond a paycheck and a credit line, a pattern repeated across the careers of countless other supporting performers whose names never made it past the closing credits in most viewers' memories. An entire hidden layer of British television history that rarely gets the same attention as its more famous headline stars, even though their combined contributions arguably shaped just as much of what audiences actually remember watching, filling out the ensemble casts and background roles that gave these classic shows their full, lived-in texture. Number 15. Leslie Grantham. Leslie Grantham became a genuine national sensation, playing the villainous Dirty Den Watts on EastEnders, a role that made him one of the most talked-about actors on British television throughout the mid-1980s, at the absolute height of the soap opera's cultural dominance. His career and personal life both grew increasingly turbulent in the decades that followed, and by his final years he was living in a cheap flat in Bulgaria, having been forced back to Britain only when a lung cancer diagnosis required treatment he couldn't otherwise access. Grantham died with virtually no money to his name, having spent his final months carefully planning and budgeting for his own modest funeral, rather than leaving that burden to his family during an already difficult time, a practical, almost business-like approach to his own mortality that friends said was entirely in character for him. The same steady, unflappable quality that had defined his performances on screen for decades, right down to the meticulous planning that had once made him such a reliable presence on set. a professionalism he apparently carried with him right up until the very last moment of his life. He died in 2018 at age 71, and just months before his death, despite his declining health and financial situation, he still took on a small film role, a final, quietly determined effort from a man who once commanded some of the biggest audiences in British television history. Colleagues on that last production later said he never once complained about his circumstances, choosing instead to focus entirely on the work in front of him for as long as his body allowed, a professionalism that left a lasting impression on younger cast and crew members who had grown up watching him on television decades earlier, many of whom said working alongside him felt like a genuine privilege regardless of the circumstances surrounding the production, a small mercy that made his final months feel less lonely than his broader financial situation might otherwise have suggested. 15 performers, and 15 strikingly similar endings for people who had, at some point, been genuinely famous across an entire nation. Some struggled with addiction or failed relationships that drained both their finances and their support systems, while others simply worked in an era before residual payments existed in any meaningful way, leaving them with little to show financially for decades of steady, reliable work. Still others were simply forgotten, their faces and voices instantly familiar to millions of viewers, who nonetheless never learned or cared to remember their actual names. A peculiar kind of fame that offers recognition without ever translating into lasting security or gratitude. The kind of fame that fills a room with warm nostalgia the moment someone mentions a show's name, without ever quite reaching the person who actually made it work. What connects every single person on this list is a body of work that helped define British television as audiences still understand and love it today. Work that far outlived the very people who created it, still airing in reruns and streaming platforms long after the actors themselves passed away largely unnoticed. New generations of viewers discovering these shows for the first time with little idea of what actually happened to the people who made them. If any of these stories surprised you, or if you think the entertainment industry still fails to take care of the performers who built it, tell us in the comments below. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one.